So, um, I want to explain exactly why I look at this thing this way. There were two fruit in the garden. One fruit was the fruit of man that had to do with man does something for him to be saved. The other fruit had to do with grace, that there's nothing that man can do to be saved. And so now when I look at this idea, this scripture that said, in the future, God saw that you were going to do something good. For those he foreknew were going to do a good work, which fruit? The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or the fruit of grace? If you were going to do a good work, and it has nothing to do with grace, then what fruit are you eating from? The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Bottom line. Why? Because you did a work. This is why when you say he foresaw that you were going to do a good work or choose him, now your salvation is in your hands, and not only that is in your hands, it has to do with you. See, it sounds really good that we have a choice and everything like that, but I think in God's sovereignty he saw that what that meant was Adam and Eve wanted to have the choice to choose good or evil. And because they were evil to begin with, they could never choose good or evil. They didn't have any power or ability to choose what was good. This is why the fruit killed them. The only fruit that could have saved them was grace. So if God looked into the future and saw that Adam and Eve were going to do a good work later on, and based on that, he predestined them. Okay, that would have been something. And this whole idea that God foresaw into the future that Esau was going to do a good work. And when Esau did this, or bad work, when Esau rejected his birthright and Jacob accepted God, that based on that God saw into the future who was the better person. Who was the one that chose and who was the one that didn't choose. Esau I loved, Esau I hated, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. You understand, when you make that statement, when you say that God foresaw into the future and saw that Esau was going to reject God by rejecting his birthright for a bowl of soup, or that Jacob was going to be the one that sees Jacob's ladder and become Israel, and say that God, based on looking into the future, was for those he foreknew, he predestined. And when you say that it has nothing to do with election, when basically Paul said in the beginning of Romans 9 that not all Israel is Israel, it is not as if the gospel had none effect. It was talking about the gospel having effect. If the gospel is going to have effect, what's it going to do? It's going to call not just those of the bloodline of the Jews, but also of us of the Gentiles, which is what Paul said. He also said that the children the twins in the womb, not having done any good or evil, those twins that were in the womb, so that God's choice, according to his will and not according to anything that they had done. So to negate the idea of that and say that it was according to something that they were going to do in the future, and try to make that claim based on Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, saying that those he foreknew, and trying to put the word foresaw in the place of foreknew, or try to read into it God foresaw, is actually twisting, because the reason why it's twisting is because it's basically taking out of context what God said in Romans chapter 9. And did that have to do with salvation? It absolutely did, because it said that the gospel, it is not as if the gospel is of none effect. So what was it talking about when it was talking about Jacob and Esau? It was talking about the gospel. Those who are chosen by promise, not having done any good or evil, so that God's purpose according to election might stand. He even said God's choice, not ours. So that it does not depend, this is Paul, so that it does not depend on the will of man or what a man does or how a man runs. This is Paul said, it does not depend on the will of man or on how a man runs, but on God who shows mercy. And you will say that's not fair. There's unrighteousness with God. And Paul said, you will say to me, there's unrighteousness with God. That's not God's nature to do that. Well, I think it is God's nature to do that, and for one big reason. Because if a man had the ability to say that he could do some sort of work in the future, then salvation is not of grace but of works, and that means that we have some room to boast. Thank you.